difficult to talk about Dr. Mathur in a few words. When I received his, profile, I requested him, what should I say? But I'll just actually say a few words and the rest you may find out. Dr. Ajeet Mathur is an affiliate life member of the Indian Psychoanalytic Society and an accredited yoga shikshak of the Bihar School of Yoga. He's a professor of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, in the area of strategic management and international business. He's also the chairperson of the Center for Gender Equity, Diversity and Inclusivity.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the precession of yoga in India and the subsequent emergence and import of psychoanalysis from the West, these two traditions stand quite apart, almost as if they were untouchables for each other. This is quite intriguing because they both value similar outcomes for human well-being through increased self-awareness, and both have been confirmed as worthwhile and are well subscribed by people, often even the same people. Yoga and psychoanalysis are distinguishable by the differences in the beliefs, norms, values, and attitudes surrounding their practices because they've evolved from assumptions and methodologies unique to their evolutionary trajectories. Each, in its various hues, providing variety, has been impregnated with social rituals, customs, traditions which are akin to religion. Their communities of practice thus come across as flag bearers of two distinct cultures. And that's where I draw the inspiration for the title of this paper, Two Cultures, and exploring the frontiers of faith in yoga and psychoanalysis. Now, neither would be possible without some modicum of faith in humanity and in the capacity of self to function as an instrument, an interlocutory container for emotional, psychological, and spiritual processes. The last of these was alluded yesterday by Sudhir Kakkar when he said that there is also a spiritual dimension in psychoanalysis. My paper focuses on the correspondences and differences at the frontiers of faith in yoga and psychoanalysis, both of which hold out extraordinary promise of experiential insights and self-learning for human well-being, but neither is in a position to actually take in the other or blend with the other from within the way in which the disciplines are structured. And therefore, practitioners such as yourselves may like to consider what it is that can be done to perhaps explore some of the synergies and blendings that might yet be possible. And I propose to share some of that, what I have attempted at IIM Ahmedabad towards the later part of this paper. Now, psychoanalysis and yoga have a lot in common. They are both practices that enable you to experience yourself from another point of view. And they both value outcomes for human well-being. They both accept the notion that lived reality involves multiple planes of consciousness, that the body and the mind affect each other, that emotions and affective states involve unconscious processes which impact conscious thoughts, feelings, and actions, that sleep and dreams have important restorative functions, that dreams contribute to our understanding about ourselves, and that a person's identity provides the continuity acknowledged by others. Today, I have been a victim of mistaken identity twice during the course of the day, one by Juma Basak, the chairperson of this session, and once by Jasmine, I wonder if she's still here, who thought that I belonged to the Antardwand Foundation. And I was wondering where this dual Antardwand, the dual inside, was being picked up. It's almost as if I was carrying on my sleeve the two incompatibles, yoga and psychoanalysis. The core fabric of the existential puzzle, as contained in the question, who am I? That's been raised time and again over human history. Lang had answered it by saying, I am what I make myself to be. But this answer is actually reached through phenomenological methods. any psychological method, whether it's psychoanalysis or whether it's psychotherapy, it involves taking care of the mind. And as early as in 1983, the Swiss practitioner Erna Hock, who was practicing in India for a number of years, she made the point that she did not any longer distinguish between taking care of the soul and taking care of the mind, and she regarded psychoanalysis and psychotherapy both as spiritual endeavors. According to her, what was important was the source of distress, such as bhaya. Bhaya might be characterized as separation anxiety or fear of a cosmic kind, rather than the Freudian notion of separation from mother. She also talked of shok or sorrow arising out of karma, moh, delusions or ignorance. And I'm reminded of the presentation on attachment that we've had this afternoon. And I was left wondering how many shades of attachment might there actually be. So that it's not as if Bowlby had said the last word on what attachment theory is. And we really need to consider degrees of attachment and shades of attachment and what they might mean to us. Vaidyanathan and Kripal have drawn attention to the connections between Freudian thinking and Indian traditions. But Freud's desk was littered with archaeological artifacts from many cultures. Freud himself stated that he drew inspiration from these as muses because his work was also like archaeology, plumbing the depths of the human mind and the stirrings of the human spirit. Now, the first known attempts by humanity at understanding processes of projection and introjection form the core of the notions around which concepts such as vyabhishari bhav, which might be loosely translated as transitional anxiety states of being, according to Bharat Muni, sanchar bhav, transference or projections, rasa, the essence juice tasted in the body from an emotion aroused or jouissance, and mudra, poses and gestures correlated with cultivation of specific bhavas or states of consciousness. These were introduced quite early in the Indian tradition. The theories formulated and practices derived from the performing arts, notably music, drama, and dance, documented in the Natya Shastra, were an early acknowledgement of what has today been recognized as emotional labor, now that we are familiar with the work of Hochschild, who talked about the managed heart. What is notable in this context is that the distinction between consciousness while awake, Jagrat, and while dreaming, Swapna, led to the recognition of the unconscious or Sushupti state in the Indian literature. The impediments to consciousness interested all those who valued reflecting and learning from experiences, and the notion of vitark, assumptions or suppositions, as preparatory to clear vision about phenomenon was termed as vichar. Now this has etymologically diffused to other Indo-European and Ugric language traditions, where the tradition of or custom or reflecting on the day's experiences at sunset, sandhya as it's called, in quiet contemplation is known as večer. In fact, in many Slavic languages we say dobre večer as a greeting, or vespers, or vespera, or visas. Now there are elements here that belong to the Indian bhava system, which distinguishes feelings like envy and hatred that trigger projections into a separate category. And that's the category called sanchar bhava. It recognized projections, it recognized transference. This distinction was missing in the Aristotelian taxonomy of emotions that was built around the dichotomous notion of pain or pleasure, which laid the foundations of the first attempts at building a theory of psychoanalysis. There are also elements comparable to the analyst-analysand relationship in a yoga-shikshak-abhyasi relationship or a guru-chela relationship. This has been very controversial. In 1973, J.S. Nakey, writing in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, contested this, pointing out that there are 7 kinds of relationships of guru-chela, and only one of them, when they become enemies, is the one that can be converted into making them co-equals. Otherwise, hierarchy remains. Later, Sudhir Kakkar has pointed out that it is possible that some of the non-verbal phenomena that is going on in the Guru-Chela relationship is worthy of our attention, because as we have just heard from Darshan Shah, there could be elements that are part of the phenomenology of what transference involves. Not always of people who are altruistic, as Darshan Shah told us. Some of the gurus were seeking money for their ashrams to the point of one of his patients committing suicide. Also, there are yogic practices like Tratak, Pranayam, Mudra, Yoga Nidra that have been distinguished from hypnotic states simply because one's consciousness is maintained in a waking state under control of the self. These are different from psychoanalytic cathexis. So while there are overlaps, there are also practices that are unique to yoga and to psychoanalysis, and the attention to connections between body and mind, the very word yoga comes from yuja, to join, are worth mentioning because we are not talking only about psychosomatic ailments, but we are also concerned with how the effects of yoga can demonstrate changes in metabolism, hormonal secretions, transcriptional gene regulations, endocrine activity, intercellular DNA and RNA, and the impacts on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. One can't, in fact, do meditation any more than one can do transference. Meditation is the state that is reached after pratyahara, which is withdrawal of the senses, and practice of dhyana, in the same way as transference is reached in a therapeutic relationship. So I'm often amused when people talk of doing meditation or talk of doing short therapies and producing or orchestrating the effects of what essentially demands its own maturity period of being able to cultivate the relatedness, not just the relationship. Western accounts of chronology are less than enthusiastic to proofs that collective human consciousness, in which individual and group experiential learning were embedded, predates the Christian era. There are records of people who closely observed nature and thinking about human nature as inseparable from nature shaped their experience. The notion that not even for a moment can a person stand still and do no work. For every person is helplessly driven to work by the forces of nature, draws attention in the Bhagavad Gita to this natural curiosity and the capacity to wonder at conditions born from perplexity and wonder. To wonder was to inquire into what sustains life, the significance of breathing, what is inside the mind, what is behind the senses, and whether we all share some common sensations and perceptions as part of inalienable dignity. Natural phenomena, as understood, requires assimilation in a culture to engage in practices even when it concerns libidinous energies and polyvalent drives. To quote Kakkar and Kakkar, the Kama Sutra's most valuable insight is that pleasure needs to be cultivated. That even in the realm of sex, nature requires culture. The way in which people reinforce norms, values, beliefs, and attitudes in a given context is what provides a common outlook or culture for their intergenerational recipes. And we heard something about this from Sarla Kapoor when she was explaining to us about the significance of both culture and religion as lifestyle. This culture of what is understood of nature requires to be encased in a living tradition, to be experientially verified by every contemporary generation. Without that, any insight would become ossified as an artifact historically endowed with fixed, discrete, and outdated meaning. Intergenerational continuities of lived traditions involve continuity and change. And this is where the challenge lies for both yoga and for psychoanalysis. And herein also lies the genesis of the difference between yoga and psychoanalysis in their evolutionary trajectories. The trajectory of yoga was characterized by discontinuities, whereas psychoanalysis, once established, was never lost, despite its myriad variants of practice. If we look at the first experimentations done by observing nature, the Tantrikas realized that by observing nature, they're getting in touch with something that is marvelous. One was the idea of what makes the universe tick. Their experience led them to identify a universal force manifested in two complementary divisions they call Prakriti, the feminine aspect, and Purusha, the masculine aspect. Psychoanalysis developed similar notions about anima and animus. These ideas of immanent dualities and dyadic encounters were further developed through yoga. Actually, Tantra and yoga evolved and developed almost simultaneously. In their striving for better and longer life, the potential yogis explored their experience of animals, trees, wind, soil, water, and fire. They noticed that tall palm trees of the Palmyra family had the capacity to withstand gale force winds. They watched how seedlings grew to great heights and coped with cyclones, and they imitated this in practices and exercises that gave rise to the Tadasana, the palm tree posture. Similarly, the Tiryaka Tadasana, the dynamic or sideways moving palm tree posture. They noticed how cats remain supple and how snakes raise themselves to great heights by straightening their backbones. These two experiences were applied in creating the Marjariyasana, the cat posture, and the Bhujangasana, the cobra posture, respectively. So it was possible for them to learn from trees and from animals because the Tantrika idea of an all-encompassing force meant that there was no other division in the cosmos. There was no question of parts and a whole. Every apparent entity was somehow a microcosm that contained the macrocosm in it. This was also the germinating idea underlying transference in psychoanalysis later on. When we look at the emergence of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and I don't have time to go into the Vedic territory of how the Shruti tradition has left us with certain notions about what knowledge is of most worth. There is very little in India's historical record from the period 500 BC to about the 16th century AD until the time of Kabir that tells us anything of the lived tradition, except for the Sufis, because both these traditions of the Tantrikas and the Yogis went underground. They started resurfacing in a limited way in the 19th century, but openly only about half a century ago. Kaivalya Dham in Lonavala, Shivananda Ashram in Rishikesh, followed by Bihar School of Yoga in Munger, were among the earliest institutions to be established in yoga, whereas the Girindra Shekhar Clinic and the Indian Psychoanalytic Society were the first institutions in India for psychoanalysis, which emerged at a time when yoga was at its nadir. The Girindra Shekhar Freud correspondence and the Roman Rolla Freud correspondence bear testimony to the brush of psychoanalysis with Indian mysticism and its concept of 5 sheets of human existence which are realizable. This discussion gives us some idea of the experiential learning methodology known in Sanskrit as darshan, a word that literally means that which has been seen or experienced. Unfortunately, as in the case of many other Sanskrit words, Western intellectuals like Max Muller translated darshan as philosophy, thereby robbing it of its basis in experiential learning. While at times in the past the word darshan was also used to mean philosophy, by and large the word for philosophy in India has been shastra. And this is where we need to really look at what is scripture, because shastra has unfortunately been translated into English as scripture. If we really look at the Upanishads, which are the post-Vedic period commentaries, for example, if you look at the Taittiriya Upanishad, we get an idea of the experiential learning traditions of the Gurukulas and the idea that a hermeneutic primary task can be synonymous with a normative one, can be traced to these experiential learning traditions where the Gurukula was an institution emphasizing experiential learning rather than instruction. The most important aspect of experiential learning was in the area of understanding the universal force, and physicists have been, particularly quantum mechanics, has brought to us an idea that there's nothing in the universe except different configurations of elementary particles, which we are not really capable of actually seeing, and these dynamic configurations form and dissolve because of our perceptual limitations. The notion of anubhav, the word that comes from Sanskrit for experience, as a unit of experience, Anubhav, itself captures the idea that minuscule atomistic impressions make up the mosaic of emotional, aesthetic, and psychological experiences. The taxonomy of how Anubhav generates the 33 transitory emotional impressions recognized in the Indian system of bhava, crystallize into more durable states of aesthetic experience, the 9 rasas of the Rasa Siddhanta, and undergo transformations. This is something I have discussed in another paper, so I won't go into it here. But it's important that because of the traditions going haywire during a period when they were suppressed, many intelligent and manipulative charlatans have set themselves up as gurus in various locations in India and abroad and changed the mode of spiritual quest from revelation through experience to salvation following the guru's orders. And this is a complete distortion because it's never easy for a suppressed tradition to resurface and thrive without an abiding commitment to institutional or organizational forms from motivation supported by power bases. And this is the problem that yoga had when it resurfaced in India in the 20th century as a byproduct of nationalism. And decades after political independence, by the time it was recognized as a holistic system for health and well-being under Ayush, the sentiment surrounding its values had been layered over in diverse traditions. So these included now naturopathy, Hindutva revivalists, Shaivite monk sannyasis, Vaishnavite sadhus, spiritual ashrams, religious sects such as Nath Sampradaya, yoga schools of Ashtanga Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Kriya Yoga, Satyananda Yoga, Bikram Yoga, Iyengar Yoga, Art of Living, Sahaj Marg, Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, Homeopathy, Reflexology, Acupressure, and the esoteric practices of the Tantrics. The eclectic Pranahuti traditions of whirling dervishes and the Naqshbandi Sufis, the mindfulness and Vipassana traditions of the Buddhists, the Shatkarmas of the Jains, and meditations and spiritual exercises of Franciscan Catholics and Jesuits. So this potpourri of conduits and carriers renders it very difficult to separate the core of yoga from the paraphernalia surrounding it in its various lineages. But it is important to attempt that to be able to grasp at its essential nature and the scope of its offering that partially overlaps in notable ways the benefits that are available through psychoanalysis. In contrast, psychoanalysis spread far and wide, from its origins in Europe taking root in many countries. So exchanging neurotic suffering for ordinary unhappiness acquired appeal. Elder notes that the real significance of Freud in psychoanalysis was the articulation of an entirely new form of psychological discourse, or introspective consciousness. Its early professionalization in 1910 as an international system in a mutually recognized fraternity, organized by a peer group, carrying on conversations in a journal enabled a certain homogeneity and convergence on norms and standards. And this did not inhibit the application of psychoanalytic insights to other arenas such as psychoanalytic psychotherapy or the study of organizations, where I use psychoanalytic insights for groups, group relations, and organizations that I am Ahmedabad, or mass observation, or for understanding whole societies. And it kept psychoanalysis shorn of religious discourses and conflicts because there was no requirement in its methods to advance any particular religious persuasion, political agenda, ethnic preference, or linguistic exclusions. But it mainly catered to a particular affluent elite class of society, and faith in the efficacy of the method spread through word of mouth. Besides the competitive comparisons of the variants, Freudian, Jungian, Langian, Kleinian, subscribed to by its practitioners in certain circles, it has, and Mathur reminded us that we should be looking at a plurality of traditions in the West. I would say we should be looking at the plurality of traditions anywhere, including in India. And that's where the importance of yoga and psychoanalysis also comes up. Curiously, just as yoga was marginalized, the interplay of four forces that are affecting psychoanalysis made it function. And I have just about 5 minutes left, so I'll be very quick about these four challenges to psychoanalysis that bring up the issue of yoga and psychoanalysis once again. Firstly, there are a large number of people who are more aware of the importance of personal, psychological, and emotional well-being than ever before. There is no corresponding supply of trained psychoanalysts available, and not even the entire pool of psychoanalysts taken together could attend to even a small fraction of the people, even if they work day and night, if everyone were to want psychoanalysis as the preferred means for enhanced self-awareness and well-being. So that's a real impossibility. For this reason alone, psychoanalysis cannot be mainstreamed and remains marginal in its scope and impact. Secondly, the availability of alternatives to psychoanalysis, such as other therapies or yoga, are less costly, less demanding from the perspective of time duration. Yoga can be learned in 1 week to 3 weeks from an instructor, and a person can continue its practice lifelong. In India, it's available free in many institutions and at an affordable cost widely all over the country. Scientific studies have been conducted to demonstrate its benefits for different practices of asanas, pranayams, mudras, and bandhs. Its popularity and appeal has spread. The World Yoga Convention 8 weeks ago in Munger attracted 24,000 participants from 57 countries. Far greater number than any conference on psychoanalysis has ever attracted. Psychoanalysis is mainly sought out by those persons who would wish to enter the therapeutic professions as analysts, therapists, counselors, and need to understand themselves as analysans with an analyst, acquire basic skills in working with transference, and who would need the stamp of recognition to professionally establish their clinical therapeutic practices. But only if they have time and money to go to an analyst 4 times a week for about 4 years and then do training analysis, then go into supervision, the kind of grouses that we've heard this morning about the IPSO. Thirdly, healthcare systems and healthcare insurance practices have incentivized short therapies. And psychoanalysis is increasingly being regarded as a luxury, privately affordable only by a few affluent people among the elites. The requirement that an ICD-10 or DSM-5 diagnosis precede treatment subsidy and subventions are made only for approvable standardized short therapeutic interventions on grounds of essentiality has again loaded the dice against psychoanalysis. And fourthly, Ajeet Chakravarti, writing her memoirs in 2010, pointed out that in permissive societies there is not much to repress, and that the superego lost its sting long back. And this calls into question sometimes the very viability of the method in certain contexts. And I'll leave you with these thoughts about the 4 challenges to psychoanalysis. I would just like to end by saying that the significance of dialogue processes and containers as internal conversations and as potential external interactions extending system boundaries is something that we have been working with at IIM Ahmedabad. But this comes from the work of Sari Mattila, who introduced mindfulness dialogues in Turku, in Finland, and for her students in Nirma University in Ahmedabad. There are 5 ways in which we have brought yoga into the curriculum alongside psychoanalytic insights in our curriculum at IIM Ahmedabad. One is the introduction of asanas, pranayams, and mudras in management development programs, working conferences, preparatory to dream work in harmony sensing matrices. Alongside experiential learning through transference in small and large groups of group relations conferences, we have brought in Yoga Nidra for corporate retreats and for strategy and organization development and team building, for visioning, discovering, and interpreting strategies using psychoanalytic frames for the study of organization behavior. Thirdly, we have adopted yogas and pranayams for de-stressing alongside using listening posts in the analytic tradition. Fourthly, we have developed a new course, Mysteries in Management, emphasizing consciousness and mindfulness, not in the world-negating sense of the Buddhist Vipassana, but in the world-affirming sense of how mindfulness can be brought to bear in the psychoanalytic traditions. And lastly, we have introduced yoga capsules as part of work with dyads, couples, and families at the Center for Gender Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity. In conclusion, these are very early days in the mainstreaming of yoga around questions of what knowledge is of most worth. There are plenty of parallels between psychoanalysis and yoga for correspondences in emotional, psychological, and aesthetic traditions. But there are also significant differences. The high dependency in Indian culture, the lifelong obligation to family members, preponderance of passive aggression or over-open defiance, attribution of stigma to identities, and the tolerance for high proliferation of boundary leakages call for an enormous leap of faith for psychoanalysis to succeed in the Indian context. The frontiers of faith in yoga make no such demand. Yet the frontiers of faith in yoga are not without their own set of demands. Practice of dharma is what Kakkar and Kakkar regard a pivotal ethical concept, modulated by a thou canst but try ethos that exists alongside the concept of karma, draws upon the notion of innate disposition with a relational orientation and with non-attachment regarded as a virtue. Although it has been claimed by Brar and commented by Chakravarti that yoga transcends the limitations of psychoanalysis by recognizing a spiritual plane of existence, this is so only to the extent that spirituality begins where religion ends, and reality begins where spirituality ends. And I'd like to leave you with this thought, because the quest for identifying with the subtle body, the Sukshma Sharir, rather the gross body, the Suthul Sharir, further needs distinguishing between self-actualizing versus theological or cosmological liberation. And the stage of Samadhi demonstrated by yogis is further evidence that although frontiers of faith in yoga may have been pushed more than the frontiers of psychoanalysis, the essential nature of both seeks to experience unplumbed depths of human consciousness. In this sense, the frontiers converge and raise hopes of possibilities of bringing the two cultures closer together as part of the same human endeavor involving physical, intellectual, emotional, mental, and spiritual processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, for a very stimulating paper. Questions, please?
Thank you very much. It was a really fascinating, scholarly, and very thought-provoking presentation.
I appreciate it if you would also introduce yourself, because at that distance I can't make out.
I'm Nilofer.
Thank you.
I was struck by one of the things that you said towards the end about society becoming more permissive and how that might change the need and the technique that psychoanalysis offers or stands for. While it is something that I have heard in different contexts, it is something I'm not really doubting, but I'm just wanting us to have a conversation around this, because I think it's a really profound question. And what I'm reminded of is a film by Buñuel, in which there is a reversal of the usual taboos, where they are going to be defecating together but dining in private. So I'm wondering if repression ever goes away, or whether it is just what is repressed that changes. It's just a thought.
That's an excellent thought-provoking comment. Really welcome that. I think it's very interesting that you should bring this up. In every civilization, and from the time of Freud's writings, we have known that there are two fundamental taboos around which repressions develop. One is the taboo against expression of aggression, and the other is the taboo against free expression of sexuality. And you would not find both these taboos coexisting. So either one or the other would be the dominant taboo in any culture. So it's, for example, in Swedish society, it's only after they lost to Napoleon that they turned pacifist and they became totally non-aggression oriented, and freedom of expression of sexuality of Swedish women reached its heights before anywhere else. The reverse happened in Afghanistan, where there was a fair amount of liberalism in the 70s, and we had a society that experienced rape at the hands of the invading Russian soldiers, and that brought about the Taliban. And we then got, again, some taboos in place against women. So I think you have a point that some repressions might give way to other repressions. That is certainly possible. On the other hand, if there are societies which are able to free themselves of conventional repressions, the stuff of which analysis is made up of, especially when it concerns life inside the family. Because life inside the family can be nuclear rather than joint in many cultures. And when it is nuclear families, you get a different kind of possibility of repression than you do when there are joint families. I'm sure those of you who are practicing would have experienced the differences. The in some of those states, you may not get that much repression in permissive societies where families are very permissive. But as a large group phenomenon, wherever we are dealing with mobs, you will always get some form of repression. So it's an open question, and I welcome it. I would be happy to continue a conversation around this. I must think more about it.
I don't know whether I'll be able to get through you or not, but anyway, I'll try.
I'll also try to understand.
Thank you. I'm Sandeep. I'm a psychiatrist. I just want to ask, your presentation was quite comprehensive, and I think extremely intelligent person, in terms of knowing things. And my wonder was, I just want to know if there are any similarities between the psychoanalysis, the practice of psychoanalysis, and the yoga and meditation practices in terms of, knowing it, the theory part of it, and just practicing it. Because, I know on one side about yoga and meditation that it is said, you just have to be a practitioner and you don't have to know anything, you just have to have a belief system. And then even the knowledge also in yoga and meditation, it's said that it gets unfolded when you become a true practitioner, or you tend to realize yourself. So it's not that the knowledge comes from outside, it comes from within. So are there any similarities between the two?
Absolutely, excellent question. Yes, there are fantastic similarities. For instance, in the analytic method, we use the couch. What does yoga suggest? Yoga says close your eyes, withdraw your senses. So even if you are not lying on a couch, if you are withdrawing your senses and you are relaxed inside of yourself, you are beginning to have feelings. And the cleansing meditations, all of them require free association, all of them, because you don't push any thoughts away. You let the feelings arise, let the thoughts arise, and don't push them away, don't cling to them, and let them work their way through. The only difference is that bodily you don't have a guru or an analyst necessarily present by your side when you're doing that. Even that is carried in the mind. That's one way of looking at it. The other is, I was reminded of Kane's remark this morning when he said that he'd like to read about prana. I was actually thinking, how do I communicate to him that however much he may read about prana for the rest of his life, the only way he can experience prana would be by closing his eyes and becoming aware of his own natural breathing. And if he did that even for 5 minutes, and if he were to look at which nostril he's breathing from, and if he were to change the nostril of breathing, which can be done by a very simple yogic kriya, which can be taught in 2 minutes, the capacity to be able to use body-mind interfaces yourself without having an external body of an analyst present exists in yoga. The methods are very similar. The philosophies and the underlying, after all, we are dealing with the same human being. We are dealing with the same processes that are internal to psychoanalysis, which are internal to yoga. Yoga is not an artificial construct.
I'm sorry, I'll have to intervene. I think one last question is what we are really out of time. Last, so I see more than one hand going up. Oh God. Okay. Dr. Kakkar has one? Okay. Yes, a privilege, I suppose.
Dr. Mathur, I absolutely compliment. It was one of the most illuminating talks on yoga and psychoanalysis which I've had the privilege to listen to. My one question was, psychoanalysis is still trying, or let's say some people are, when you talk about Buddhism, yoga, etc., what we psychoanalysts can learn from yoga. Are there similar efforts in the yoga of what they can learn from psychoanalysis, the perils of transference and acting out, all the various kind of things? Because my fear is that yoga at the moment is at its height, and it might also become as arrogant as psychoanalysis once did in the United States in the 60s, which then lead to a downfall.
Absolutely. I think, let me answer that. That's a brilliant, beautiful question. I think the yoga systems have already become very arrogant. They are already so arrogant that they have entrapped themselves in wrappings and paraphernalia, which they think is intrinsic to the method, which is actually not at all necessary in the method. But because they have created whole systems out of it and it's a commercial enterprise, their willingness to also take in from other traditions is rather limited. Last year, I offered free places to yogis in some of the psychoanalytic work we do in IIM Ahmedabad. Even after I offered free places, there were no takers. We do group relations working conferences every year. This year we did 2, and I have offered free places to yogis and sannyasis. No takers, because they're not willing to open their minds. And I think fundamentally, it's any kind of dialogue, and this is the critical thing about the psychoanalytic method, that the openness that the analyst and the analysm are able to bring into the therapeutic contract is remarkable, because that is the kind of relationship and relatedness that a Guruchala ought to have. And I must confess that I myself have had the good fortune of having had such a Guru. But not everybody has had that kind of opportunity. So then you don't see the parallels, but I have seen parallels from my own experience of having had a Guru and having also done psychoanalysis. So, and you're right, people are not willing. So I can see this compartmentalization both ways. Psychoanalysis is unwilling to look at yoga, yoga is unwilling to look at psychoanalysis. They've both become Harijans to each other, to use Gandhi's terminology.
Audience, please pardon me, I think we require to close down this session.
Well, I'll be very happy to continue conversations and answer any questions offline. I'm still available through the evening. Thank you very much.